Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the annual Dr. Abdul Lodhi Memorial Lecture in Human Rights, presented by the Atlantic Human Rights Center and St. Thomas University with support from the Environment and Society program. I'm Dr. Christina Shirley, Director of the Atlantic Human Rights Center and Associate Professor in the Human Rights Department. As a brief note about tonight's program, Acting President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Kim Fenwick, will welcome you and introduce our speaker. UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, Dr. Ian Fry, will deliver a lecture titled The Face of Climate Change, with a Q&A session to follow. This evening will close with a presentation of the Atlantic Human Rights Center Award for Excellence in Human Rights. Throughout this event, your microphone and camera will be switched off, but we still want to hear from you. Our featured speaker, Dr. Ian Fry, will respond to questions following his lecture. We encourage you to submit your written question by using the chat box located in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Note that questions from students will receive priority. If you are a student, please indicate your year of study and major when submitting your question. The moderator will then read your question for Dr. Fry's consideration and response. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kim Fenwick to say a few words of welcome, not only in her principal capacity as Acting President and Vice Chancellor at St. Thomas University, but also as Vice Chair of the Atlantic Human Rights Center Advisory Board.
Thank you, Christina. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of St. Thomas University, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture. I would first like to acknowledge that St. Thomas University is located on the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq peoples. At the entrance to our campus, the flags of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq Grand Council are flown to acknowledge both the past and the shared future of our Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. The inspiration for this lecture, Dr. Abdul Lodhi was a distinguished scholar and human rights advocate who co-founded the Atlantic Human Rights Center. He would be astounded at the subjects the lecture has addressed. Past speakers have spoken on disarmament, profiling, poverty, 9/11, and Indigenous law. He would also be amazed and proud at the growth of our human rights program. STU is one of few universities in Canada that offers an undergraduate human rights program. Our department chair, Dr. Amanda DiPaolo, is a winner of the Association of Atlantic Universities Distinguished Teaching Award and founded our world-class moot court program. Dr. Christina Shirley is a specialist in international human rights law and serves as director of the Atlantic Human Rights Center. And our endowed chair in human rights, Dr. Shannon Brooke Murphy, has 2 decades of experience in human rights policy. These professors offer our students outstanding learning opportunities in the classroom and engagement with the wider community on human rights issues. I know that our students are also inspired by the quality of the guest speakers we are able to attract, and this evening's speaker fits that bill. Dr. Ian Fry is a dual citizen of Australia and Tuvalu and worked for the Tuvalu government for 2 decades, ultimately serving as their ambassador for climate change and environment. In May 2022, he was appointed as Special Rapporteur for the United Nations Human Rights Council on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. Dr. Fry also teaches part-time at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. He specializes in international environmental policy, international climate change policy, and environmental law. Dr. Fry, welcome, and we are delighted to have you join us tonight for this lecture at STU.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to speaking with you. At the outset, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Australia, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that the land has never been ceded. So I want to talk on the issue of human rights and climate change, and I'll just see if I can share my screen. So I'm wanting to talk about the face of climate change. And it's very evident that we are facing a global crisis in the name of climate change. Throughout the world, human rights are being negatively impacted and violated as a consequence of climate change. For many millions, climate change constitutes a serious threat to the ability of present and future generations to enjoy the right to life. So that's just basically one human right, the right to life, is being threatened. We are facing an enormous climate change crisis, and there is enormous injustice being manifested by developed economies against the poorest and least able to cope. These affect various human rights, including the right to food, water, health, shelter, life, freedom from exploitation, to name just a few. And this is a critical issue to be considered in our response to this human rights dilemma, the responsibility of the developed world. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change notes that there is an implementation gap between the projected emissions with current policies and the projected emissions resulting from the implementation of the unconditional and conditional elements of nationally determined contributions. So this is the pledges made in the Paris Agreement are called nationally determined contributions. And it's very clear that what countries have put on the table so far are not sufficient to direct us towards a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on global warming as required under the Paris Agreement. So there's certainly a significant implementation gap. The International Energy Agency has called for an immediate end to fossil fuel expansion if the world is to decarbonize by 2050 and limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius as required by the Paris Agreement. This is quite a major statement by a UN agency to make that call for the stopping expansion of fossil fuels. Unfortunately, that advice has not been heeded. So a lot of responsibility falls on the G20 countries. In 2019, for example, the world's major emitters of carbon dioxide, China, United States, India, the European Union, plus UK, Russia and Japan, together emitted 67% of total fossil carbon dioxide. And so the G20 countries, have produced cumulatively 78% of all emissions over the last decade. And collectively, the G20 countries are not on track to achieve their unconditional nationally determined contributions are based on pre-COVID projections. Within that sort of consideration of what countries are doing in their nationally determined contributions is the enormous amount of money being spent on fossil fuel subsidies. The global economy is driving in the opposite direction. Studies suggest that subsidies for fossil fuels is estimated to be around $500 billion annually. And if you can see this chart here, Canada is sort of fourth on the list as far as fossil fuel subsidies. So this is a major problem that governments are still heavily subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. On top of this fossil fuel subsidy is what's called the Energy Charter Treaty. This is an agreement that was established to guarantee supply of energy. And what we're seeing now is this Energy Charter Treaty is being used by fossil fuel producers using investor-state dispute settlements within the Energy Charter Treaty to sue states for compensation if they take positive actions to reduce their use of fossil fuels. So this is a treaty that is driving against climate change action. It is estimated that legal claims by oil and gas investors against states imposing laws to limit fossil fuel activities could reach a total of 340 billion. And it's not just developed countries. I'm certainly aware that some developing countries, Mozambique faced a huge was sued by fossil fuel companies for their actions to reduce their emissions. So these are critical issues. And in my report to the UN General Assembly last year, I called for the repealing of the Energy Charter Treaty. And certainly there are countries taking steps to do that. I think France and Denmark have announced that they're going to withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty. So there are a large number of human rights implications of a lack of action on climate change. And people who suffer the impacts of climate change are forced to be displaced from their land, and that includes significant human rights implications: the right to food, water, sanitation, health, shelter, education, and some the right to life. And this is particularly, a gender issue. Women have particular human rights issues. After severe weather events or extreme drought, women may be forced to walk long distances to collect water. In these circumstances, they are subject to harassment, sexual violence, and trafficking. And I'll explore this a little further based on my visit to Bangladesh last year. I've been working with the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. She presented a report to the UN General Assembly last year on violence against women and the implications of climate change. The issue around this climate change and human rights is an intersectional issue. It's linked to many other issues that connect and cross over. So there's certainly gender issues. There are issues around sexual orientation and gender identity. So people, gender diverse people, have their own particular issues around human rights issues. People with disabilities. I met with a group of people with disabilities at the last Conference of Parties in Egypt, and they, provided, particular concerns, particularly because a lot of those people aren't able to escape some of these climate change events, and therefore, are subject to, severe droughts or floods. And the floods here in Australia were last year were a testimony to that. The people with disabilities were the ones most killed by those floods. Health and freedom. Last year at the Climate Change Conference, I also met with people from African American communities, and they, explained their particular circumstances. With Hurricane Maria and Katrina, the loss of lives came out of a legacy of neglect and racism. So that, there's truly a significant racism aspect to climate change impacts and human rights. So as was explained, my position started with a resolution from the Human Rights Council in 2021, and it was to study and identify how the effects of climate change, including sudden and slow onset disasters, affect the full and effective enjoyment of human rights, and make recommendations on how to address and prevent these adverse effects, particularly in ways to strengthen integration of human rights into policy making, legislation plans, and addressing climate change. And the resolution has a number of other sub-items as well, so there's a lot to be done. So this position, our Special Rapporteur, is a 3-year position. So, and I have to report each year to the Human Rights Council in June, and then to the UN General Assembly each October. So I've divided my three-year work into sort of 6 thematic areas. So the first one is mitigation, adaptation, and financial actions to address climate change, with a particular emphasis on loss and damage. And this, I chose this issue particularly because at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, there was a focus on the issue of loss and damage, and to bring forward the idea of a loss and damage fund. My report to the Human Rights Council in June this year will be focusing on climate change displacement. And this will be looking at particularly the issue of people who are displaced from their homeland as a consequence of climate change events, who are forced to cross international borders. These people are not defined as refugees under the Refugee Convention. while we often call them climate change refugees, they have no formal status as refugees under the UN Convention, and therefore they fall through the cracks as far as legal protection is concerned. So I'm trying to explore what additional legal protections can be provided to people displaced across international borders. And there's clearly evidence to show that the number of people displaced across international borders throughout the world are at least in their millions at the moment. The next work I'll be looking at will be my report to UN General Assembly later this year, and it'll be looking at legislation, litigation, and advancing the principle of intergenerational justice. So the concept of intergenerational equity has been around for a long time. It was first introduced in the Stockholm Conference way back 50 years ago, and is seen in a number of international treaties. But the issue is that intergenerational justice has never been properly enshrined in international law, and I'm trying to explore how that could be advanced. I'm also looking at, what is the most recent trends in climate change litigation, and are there areas where there are, gaps in the litigation. We know, for instance, that there are youth groups who have brought litigation and have been thrown out of court. And so I'm looking at the sort of access to court issues as well in looking at this issue. The next thematic area is corporate accountability, and certainly looking at the economic and social responsibility aspects of that, and reporting requirements by corporations. There has been some work in the United States on this, and particularly within the European Union. And I'm wanting to see how this issue can be advanced further to ensure that corporations are properly reporting, particularly in their investments in the fossil fuel industry. And that includes financial institutions as well. The issue I'm looking at is just transition for workers in industries that contribute to climate change. So these are workers in the fossil fuel industry who will be left behind or stranded as we move towards renewable energy technologies, and how to protect their rights and ensure that they're given opportunities in this sort of transition to renewable energy economies. And finally, I'll be looking at the impacts of new technologies. So these are the technologies, that sometimes come under the definition of geoengineering, but these are technologies that are designed. If we overshoot the 1.5 degrees Celsius, there is a view held by some that we should be taking more drastic measures. So these include things like cloud brightening and other sorts of geoengineering solutions. Of course, these types of solutions, engineering solutions, will have significant human rights implications. The ones around atmospheric changing or cloud brightening are likely to be more effective around the equator, and therefore will that affect agricultural production. And so these are the things that I'll be looking at. So as part of my work, through my teaching at the Australian National University, I've created a gender and climate rights research hub, noting that the particular focus of ensuring that gender issues is foremost in the considerations of the human rights issues that I'm dealing with. So I have students who are helping me, explore the thematic issues that I'm dealing with, and ensure that there is a human rights and gender focus to those. But not only is there human rights implications of not doing enough on climate change, there are also human rights implications of mitigation actions to address climate change. So these are technologies and actions to actually try and address climate change, and there are human rights implications of those as well. So, I've met online and at the COP with Indigenous peoples of the Amazon region who are experiencing human rights implications of hydro dams. And this is a serious issue for many First Nations people around the globe, is that their land is being appropriated, downstream effects of their water supplies are being affected as a consequence of these large hydro dams. There are also issues around forests and mitigation efforts around forests. And one of these, is a push for bioenergy burning and bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So this is seen technically as a carbon neutral or carbon negative technology, where you grow trees, they absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You then burn that wood to produce electricity, and the emissions from that are then captured and put underground. But of course, there are serious implications of providing the feedstock for energy production in biomass burning. And I've been contacted by women's groups in Latin America where land has been appropriated for large-scale plantations for this bioenergy production. And so there are, again, human rights implications around that. Of course, there, as we're moving to more, vehicles and battery storage, electronic battery storage, there are issues around sourcing the minerals for this new renewable energy technology. And there have been concerns expressed about, the mineral exploration of lithium and other major metals, and including gold as well, because of the human rights implications of gold mining, particularly small-scale gold mining, which uses mercury, and the human rights implications of the use of mercury. In this part of the world, in the Pacific region where I've been working for many years, there's a lot of debate around the issue of deep seabed exploration and mining for minerals to meet this new economy of batteries. And this is manganese nodules are being explored, and one Pacific Island country has sought an exploration license from the International Seabed Authority, and that's caused quite considerable concern within our region about this. I also met with Sami people when I was at the COP last year, and they expressed concern about the installation of wind turbines on their territory. We often think of wind turbines being fairly benign, but clearly there are human rights implications of that. There was not free, prior informed consent of the Sami people about the installation of these wind turbines. And this affects the range of their reindeer, because the reindeer do not like these wind turbines. And of course, roads to service these wind turbines is opening up the territory of the Sami people. So these are major concerns. I want to look at this issue of climate change displacement because it's sort of something that I'm working on quite closely at the moment. And, there are the United Nations Refugee Agency, the High Commission for Refugees, estimates that globally forced displacement has surpassed 84 million at mid-2021. So these predominantly are people internally displaced as a consequence of climate change, but a proportion of those are being displaced across international borders. And so the concern is also that there's a large percentage of these people are below the ages of 18 years of age. And this has particular challenges, as we will see as I get into this talk. So last year I visited Bangladesh and to see firsthand the implications of climate change on the population of Bangladesh. And in 2020, 4.4 million people were displaced due to disasters in 2020, predominantly from Cyclone Amphan, which resulted in 2.5 million displacements of people from their land. So this is, through flooding and seawater intrusion, through storm surge intrusion of farmland that made the farmland no longer usable because of seawater inundation. And recent studies suggest that between 300 to 400,000 people migrate to cities each year because their land is no longer viable because of climate change impacts in Bangladesh. And what this leads to is a large number of people in informal settlements around the major city of Dhaka. And they're estimated that there are 5 million people inhabiting around about 5,000 slums. With 4 million residents and 5,000 slums. And this has significant impacts for the people living in that area. As you can see by the picture, the housing is inadequate. There's inadequate access to water, there's sanitation, to healthcare services, to education for children. And of course, their housing is poorly designed for heat extremes. So these people suffer the sort of double impacts of climate change. They've been displaced from their land, their rural land, because of climate change, and they're forced to live in informal settlements where they are again suffering the impacts of climate change. And this again has a particular issue for a gender issue. Women have to walk long distances to collect food, and can be subjected to sexual harassment and even trafficking into the sex trade. So there are serious implications that connect with climate change in that respect. Another factor is that I recently had a meeting with a special rapporteur reporter for the Security Council, looking at the implications of climate change and armed conflict. And it's a fact that a number of countries that are suffering from armed conflicts are also the countries that are suffering severe impacts of climate change. And there are overlaps in those issues. Climate change is driving people to be displaced, and that causes tensions within communities, and that sort of drives armed conflict. And that includes Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Somalia, and Yemen are in states of violence and protracted conflict, and also suffering the impacts of climate change. And so, conflict and climate change creates all sorts of issues for people, having a lack of food security, rising prices of food, and income losses as a consequence of that. And one further implication of this is that as I was saying, that children are being displaced across international borders, young people, and are being recruited by militia. And if you see, there are very sad cases. You can see them on YouTube. The UNICEF are doing work to rehabilitate these child soldiers and bring them back to a normal life. And their testimonies say that they were recruited, they had no choice, and they were forced into situations where they had to kill or be killed themselves. So there are very serious issues around that. Of course, there are many issues around people who are trying to draw attention to these issues of environmental rights issues and environmental crimes and the impacts of climate change. And this picture highlights two gentlemen who were killed in the Amazon last year, the year before last, who were trying to defend Indigenous peoples against climate change and environmental rights abuses. I recently attended a meeting organized by the Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders with people from Russia who are suffering, significant issues around, expansion of coal mines and the impacts of climate change. I've scrubbed out their faces, so that they can remain anonymous. The only faces you see are UN staff. And these people are very brave. They have harrowing stories. If they're part of an organization within Russia that receives finance from countries outside Russia, they're defined as foreign agents and therefore can be put in jail. If they hold public protests of more than two people or more, they can be put in jail. So what one person was saying is that they hold individual protests in many cities around Russia on certain issues, and these people are very brave. Most of the people who spoke online are now living outside Russia for fear of their lives because of the circumstances there. So these are very brave people trying to draw attention to the issues that are facing Russia. In fact, there were lawyers there who were running a case in the Supreme Court of Russia, and the court threw out their case, effectively denying that climate change was a reality. So what are some of the recommendations that I've been working on to come out of this issue? And there are certainly a number of recommendations around stronger policy commitment, human rights due diligence, greater stakeholder engagement, and grievance mechanisms. So I'll briefly look at some of those. So at the last climate change COP, there was certainly a call for greater political will to reduce greenhouse gases at scale. And in my report to the UN General Assembly last year, I made a recommendation that the UN Secretary General host a major pledging conference this year to get countries to commit to much deeper cuts in their emissions. The Secretary General, either by coincidence, was also thinking along the same lines, and he's holding a major climate change summit this year against the world leaders' opening of the UN General Assembly. So that'll be in September this year. What we did see is a commitment to a loss and damage fund at the last COP to help deal with those who are affected by the impacts of climate change now. My concern is that, if it's dealt with just purely by the Conference of Parties, there won't be a lot of innovation in the loss and damage fund. So I also recommended that the Secretary General host a gathering of finance experts who can think outside the box and think up, major initiatives to find new finance to fund loss and damage. This might be taxes on fossil fuels, levies on airlines, drawdowns from the IMF, cancellation of debt. There are a number of ideas out there that could be useful to sort of enhance considerations of funding for loss and damage. Around the area of human rights due diligence, I've been looking at this issue of business and disclosure proceeds, how to get work on the value chain of products and see whether there are human rights abuses and whether fossil fuels are being used in this. And I've been working with the UN guiding principles in business and human rights is a start. It's a non-legally binding treaty, and we're trying to explore whether this should be developed into a new treaty. On the issue of stakeholder engagement, it's clearly in my talks with people around the world that we need a greater voice of civil society in decision making. And there was significant steps made in Latin America with the Escazú agreement, which is a regional agreement on access to information, public participation and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is quite a significant step forward. And hopefully this sort of regional initiative will expand further into other regions, to ensure that there is, proper avenues for people to draw attention to their concerns. Just looking at the issue of grievance mechanisms and other remediation processes, certainly, one of the critical issues is the number of people who have died who are environmental rights defenders, and this is or suffered harassment or torture as a consequence of being environmental rights defenders. And I hear from those people or advocates for those people from various parts of the world. So I also proposed, establishing an international tribunal to indict perpetrators of human rights abuses against environmental and human rights defenders. So I'm hoping that there will be some follow-up to that sort of recommendation, and I'm more than happy, if the listeners here would be interested in following up on that issue and trying to work on that. So that's just a sort of brief overview of the work that I'm doing as Special Rapporteur. There's lots to be done, and I really thank you for inviting me to give this presentation, and I'm more than happy to take any questions. Thank you. I'll just see if I can. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fry, for your thought-provoking lecture, which shed light on the disproportionate impact that climate change has on the least economically developed nations, on those who are least responsible for climate change. And I must say, as a human rights professor, I was especially pleased and impressed that you adopted an intersectional approach towards your mandate here. So now we're going to begin our Q&A portion of the evening. As a reminder, you're welcome to submit a written question by using the chat box located in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, questions from students will be given priority. So if you are a student, please indicate your year of study and major. As the moderator, I'll then read your question for Dr. Fry's consideration and response. Depending on the number of questions received, we may not be able to address all questions in the interest of time. Our first question of the evening has to do with your mandate, Dr. Fry. You mentioned during your presentation that your mandate is relatively recent, and human rights students may be aware there's also a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment. You are the Special Rapporteur on human rights and climate change. How are those two mandates distinct, and how do you work together to advance your work?
Yes, thank you. In fact, the Special Rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment was carrying the climate change load until my position was created. And so now I'm primarily focusing on the climate change aspects, and David Boyd, the Special Rapporteur on right to healthy environment, is sort of covering the other issues. But we interact very closely, and we have regular meetings. It's likely we're going to join an amicus brief for a case that's been brought by Colombia and Chile to the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, around connections around climate change and the healthy environment. So, and we're also working with a Special Rapporteur on toxics as well. In fact, I'm joining a session with him later today, looking at the connection between toxic chemicals and climate change, because as I was explaining, there are issues around the mining of minerals and things like that, which have particularly human rights implications. So we try and work together on a number of these issues.
Thank you very much for your response, Dr. Fry. Our next question comes from a third-year student in International Relations and Human Rights, who's asking, what is the importance of adding a specific focus on the rights of children within environmental legislation in Canada? What is the most effective way to justify this to government officials?
Yes, well, can't sort of give a straight answer on this about the circumstances of Canada, but it's certainly that there are clear implications on the Convention on the Rights of Child, as far as people who are displaced by climate change, and giving proper protection for those people, and particularly children in that circumstances to afford special protection. But of course, there are connections to this intergenerational equity issue, and intergenerational justice is a crucial issue. And I've been meeting with youth groups and children groups around these issues of intergenerational justice. So, incorporating that within domestic legislation is critical, to draw from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also, in bringing in this issue of intergenerational justice would be critical.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. We just got a question from a second-year human rights student asking, if enacted, what might an international tribunal on environmental issues look like to you?
Well, there are certainly, examples of international tribunals, and this needs to be explored further. The International Criminal Court is one example of such a tribunal, and so that sort of model might be useful. But I don't have fixed views on this, and I'm more than happy to have further considerations around how a tribunal would work best, I guess. I mean, the critical issue is, to establish such a tribunal, you need countries to ratify the agreement, and therefore you need to get in-country support for that. So there's a lot of negotiations would need to take place to get such a tribunal up and running. So, there's a lot of work to be done in that regard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. We received another question here from a first-year French major who would like to know how you pitch to large institutions that deal with finances to be persuaded by the argument that climate change is pressing and needs to be invested in to mitigate and prevent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this is a critical issue, and it's certainly, there's an annual meeting of business and human rights each year in Geneva, and I'll be attending that, and that includes a number of private finance institutions, and certainly, the issue is that they're going to be suffering liabilities as a consequence of their investments in fossil fuels, and we're starting to see more litigation around that area of due diligence of directors of companies, and so that's a critical issue. And certainly, talking to some of the multilateral development banks is a critical aspect of this as well, and ensuring that their responsibilities are affected by climate change. That their investments are climate friendly. And we've just recently seen a change in the head of the World Bank. And part of that, came from a public reaction to the former head of the World Bank seeming to be a denier of climate change. So, these, are initiatives and movements by various civil society organizations. I was contacted just yesterday by a group of a civil society organization looking at the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a major investment bank of China, which is developing gas pipelines in Uganda, and expressing concern about that. So I'm looking into that issue as well. And clearly that sort of investment bank is a key player in investments in the expansion of fossil fuels. So I'm seriously looking at that issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. Another question came in from a second-year human rights student who's asking, what does the average day look like for a UN Special Rapporteur on climate change and human rights?
Yes, that's a good question. There is no average day. I think it's a challenging issue. Is that there are new things just come up all the time. I'm regularly invited to various meetings. I have meetings later today on the toxic chemicals. I have further discussions. I'm going to Los Angeles next week to attend the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I could, if I wanted to, be circling the globe attending all these events, because there's so much. But of course, I have some conscience about the amount of greenhouse gases that I would be burning up if I did travel around the world constantly. So that there are, the thing is my work has involved a number of issues. Firstly, I write reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. I can give talks like I'm doing now. I can also write allegation letters, so these are letters of complaint about human rights abuses connected to climate change, and I get lots of requests around those allegation letters. So I've recently done one for Indigenous people community in Western Australia who are affected by the expansion of a gas pipeline. And so I've written to the company and the Australian government around that. And I've received allegation letters. Well, I wrote to the Egyptian government before the last climate change COP, expressing concern about human rights activists, whether they'd be allowed to protest. So these are some of the issues that I'm engaged with. So there's a lot to be done, I guess. And at the moment, I'm sort of focusing on this report on displacement. I've held consultations, online consultations with people in Latin America, and I'll be holding online consultations with people from Africa and Europe in a week's time. So it's a very varied position, and there's never a dull moment.
I bet there is not. And when I read that question, I knew that there is no typical day as a UN Special Rapporteur. There is a third-year human rights and Native Studies student who's asking, at COP27, Afghanistan was excluded from the summit. As climate change has no national boundaries, how can we overcome political differences in order to bring high-risk rights holders from countries like Afghanistan into the conversation?
That's interesting. I wasn't aware that Afghanistan was excluded from the COP. I don't know whether it was Afghani NGOs, but theoretically, if Afghan is a member of the UN and is attending a UN conference as a party to the Paris Agreement and Climate Convention, they shouldn't be excluded. So I wasn't aware that they had been excluded, and certainly they shouldn't have been. And if that was the case.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from a first-year major in gerontology who is asking, is there a particular law or article / provision this question is cut off, so I'm unable to finish it. I would like to return to a point that you raised earlier, Dr. Fry, about the distinction between refugees and environmental migrants. And I just wanted to revisit that because it's a really important point. You have refugees who have protection under international law, environmental migrants who don't, and sort of slip through the cracks. Do you see there being an international treaty similar to the Refugee Convention, but for environmental migrants in the future?
Yeah, this is part of the discussions I'm having, and there are a couple of legal options. There could be a standalone treaty to deal with people displaced by climate change, or it could be in a sort of optional protocol to the Refugee Convention. Because the High Commission for Refugees does a lot of the work around this issue, and they are tending to support people who are climate change displaced people across borders or climate change migrants. I tend to think that they're best placed to administer this sort of illegal agreement. So perhaps an additional protocol to the treaty, the UN Convention on Refugees could be useful. In fact, there's a Cartagena protocol which operates in Latin America, which broadens the definition of refugees to people who have suffered from public disorder, I think it is. And so that broadens the opportunity to include people affected by climate change. So, certainly the option is either to broaden regional agreements on dealing with refugees, or to perhaps have an optional protocol to the Refugee Convention. I think that's the most likely area for where that work could develop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. So the question that was cut off earlier is full now. First-year major in gerontology is asking, is there a particular law or article that can be referred to or relied upon to combat climate change?
Well, we have, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change are both international law that create obligations on states to reduce their emissions. They're very general in nature, and that's the nature of international negotiations, is to get everybody on board. You have to make lots of compromises. So, they're not as strong as we would like. And I was certainly engaged in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement as part of the Tuvalu delegation. And certainly we weren't happy that there weren't strong enough provisions of it. If you look at the preamble to the Paris Agreement, there is also reference to human rights there as well. But, you know, the matter of this is international law, and then each country is encouraged to develop domestic legislation to implement their obligations under the Paris Agreement. So, you know, all countries are working on climate change legislation, and that's part of what I'm doing as my report to the UN General Assembly later this year will be a review of climate change legislation and how effectively countries are implementing obligations with respect to loss and damage.
Thank you kindly, Dr. Fry. That brings our question and answer period to a close, but please hang on. We have a special treat for you, Dr. Fry.
Oh, thank you.
Each year, we dedicate this lecture in memory of Dr. Abdul Lodhi, a professor of sociology at St. Thomas University and the founder and first director of the Atlantic Human Rights Center, for his contributions to our community, and in particular for his devotion to peace, understanding, and acceptance and respect between all peoples. Dr. Lodhi was presented with the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission Award in 1989. And every year, the Atlantic Human Rights Center likewise pays tribute to the outstanding contributions of one individual to the promotion of human rights. Dr. Ian Fry, you are this year's recipient of the Atlantic Human Rights Center Award for Excellence in Human Rights. We confer this award in recognition of your groundbreaking work at the forefront of combating climate change through a human rights lens and at an international level. Dr. Fry, if we were in person, I'd take great pleasure in handing this award directly to you. As it is, it will be delivered to you in a few days. The Atlantic Human Rights Center and St. Thomas University are deeply honored and most grateful to our featured speaker, Dr. Ian Fry, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to give tonight's lecture. We are likewise grateful to Acting President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Kim Fenwick, for agreeing to formally introduce our guest speaker. Kind thanks are also extended to the Environment and Society program, with special mention to the program director, Dr. Janice Harvey, and Assistant Professor Tracy Glynn for their support. Many thanks are also due for the generous and essential behind-the-scenes support of Brianna Bourgeois, Administrative Assistant at the Atlantic Human Rights Center, Jeffrey Carlton, Vice President of Communications, and Jacqueline Cormier from the Communications team, along with Terry Kelly and Kaylee Moore for their technical support of this virtual lecture. All of these contributions are what made this evening's event possible. I thank each and every one of you in our audience who's taking the time and effort to join us for this special event. Your presence is greatly appreciated. The recording will be made available on STU's official YouTube channel in the coming days. That's it for our program. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you very much.